Welcome to Mindfulness Manufacturing. My name is Trevor Blondeel. Spending 25 years in manufacturing, I discovered the real impact we have on turnover, communication, and the ability to manage change is how we show up. That's the essence of emotional intelligence. In each episode, we bring a guest or message to expand your skills, engage your people, and grow your organization. So let's jump in. Leadership can be a constant struggle between our intellect and our emotions. And I heard this from a friend, Shawn Dawley. He's with us today on the show, and he has 25 years of combat experience as an Air Force pilot, commander, and inspector general. He helped leaders understand that whole psychology aspect that accompanies like even routine leadership challenges. Shawn, where did this saying come from?
Well, first off, Trevor, thank you for having me here today. So on December 17th, 1903, the Wright Flyer took to the skies at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And you can only imagine what it would have been like to strap yourself into something like that and take to flight as the first human to ever get off the ground in a heavier than air type of an aircraft. And as you can imagine, that was not a very safe endeavor. And that industry, which didn't even have a name in the early years of its existence, claimed a lot of lives. World War I comes along, the technology gets a little bit better, the 20s, the 30s. But for decades, you really took your life into your own hands when you strapped into any type of an aircraft. Well, the technology got better, but even by the 50s and 60s, planes were still subject to a significant number of mechanical malfunctions, and you just never quite knew if that rust bucket was going to hold together. But by the 70s, after accident investigation boards have come to town, the engineers were saying, you need to stop looking at us. The plane is not the problem. It's the pilots. And with the invention of cockpit voice recorders, or in those instances where people were surviving aircraft accidents and could tell the tale, what we were finding was that the dynamic in the cockpit, more often than not, was the causal factor in an aircraft mishap. Now, there's stats out there, and I think that something like 78, 80% of most aircraft accidents are caused by what are known as human factors. You still make allowances for weather phenomena, for mechanical malfunctions that will manifest at the most inopportune times. But what we figured out in the aviation industry was that the environment in the cockpit, whether it was one of nurture and transparency, whereby the captain created an atmosphere where people were at liberty to point out problems, make note of deviations, bring to his or her attention, at that time, typically his attention, things that needed to be addressed, or was that crew being run by a tyrant who had one leadership style, which was my way or the highway. If you don't like it, you can get out of the plane right now at 30,000 feet. And so eventually the profession had to take itself into account and say, okay, wait, we're doing something wrong. Rarely was that pilot unqualified, uneducated, lacking in intellect. Some of those pilots were extremely charismatic. Some of them were exceptionally introverted. So it wasn't their personality. It wasn't their intellect. It was not their training. It was not their experience. It was what we would now call emotional intelligence. I think once upon a time we just called it basic maturity, manners, learning how to be self-aware, socially aware. And so as a new pilot myself, you would routinely sit through mishap investigation after action reports. And once again, very common theme was the decorum, if you will, in the cockpit. And I began to think, this is a wonderful lesson. So as a pilot, there was direct, tangible applicability that I could take away from that in how I ran a crew, how I ran a formation. But I recognized that the lessons that I'm learning here are not exclusively and only focused on, cockpit operations in a modern complex aircraft. I thought, how many times in any other leadership capacity have I fallen flat on my face? Not because I lacked the intellect, not because I wasn't the most charismatic person in the room, but because I did something, said something, where after the fact I realized, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I did that. I knew better.
This is a different perspective, right? And I appreciate, one is your service, and two is just we need to hear messages in different ways. And as a consumer of just flying, if you're in the plane, you're thinking, oh man, like I hope all the safety checks and the plane's good. We're not usually sitting there in your passenger thinking, man, I hope this crew is connected. I hope that the team feels safe, that they can bring up their opinion if they think something's not right. And you just kind of just blew my mind, because it's like, oh yeah, there are people flying this plane. This is not all automated.
That's right.
And in manufacturing, we kind of get stuck on, just stick to the process and don't blame the people. But at the same time, manufacturing processes only get better when there's that environment where people can just speak what's on their mind. And that's where we can bring up problems. And wow, what a connection you just made.
Yeah. So, imagine a scenario where you have a real dictator in the left seat of that wide body Boeing that you're crossing the Pacific Ocean on. He's got 15,000 hours in that and other airframes, so a wealth of knowledge about instrument procedures. He knows the aircraft systems inside and out. He is terminally proficient in that craft. That he cannot learn more intellectually about his tasks, but he brings into the cockpit a persona that has been built up over a lifetime. So he may by disposition already be a tad, let's say, aggressive, or he may be a tad passive. Now, what were his preceding 24, 48, 72 hours like? Was he coming off of some horrendous news due to a personal tragedy? Did he find out that his beloved child was diagnosed with a significant illness? Did he find out that his financial advisor had done some things improperly and he's looking at a pretty gaping hole in his 401k? I mean,
mine somewhere else.
Any number of things, right, that we all can relate to. And now imagine that there is some sort of relatively benign but tangible malfunction with that aircraft. And unfortunately, because he had set the temperature, metaphorically speaking, in the cockpit, maybe that first officer is disinclined to point out, hey, that little red light is on, or that gauge, that needle is pointing, outside the green.
He's already in a bad mood, and and maybe I'm not right. Like maybe that light's okay to be on, right? So I'm just gonna not say anything. That could happen.
Sure. So then all of a sudden, you've created inadvertently a culture whereby somebody has information you need as a decision maker, and the quicker they get you that, the better your decision and the wider range of options you have. So let's say they finally do pipe up and they point something out and they even begin to offer a course of action, but you shut them down because you have just gruffly settled in on your preferred method of dealing with it, and you may have just turned off a wonderful solution that would have rectified the problem quickly. And when we look at aircraft mishaps and we reverse engineer them, what we find is that there was 10, 12 points along the way where if the aircraft commander, the pilot in command, the guy with his hand on the rudder and the stick, would have just simply been more emotionally engaged, more open, more self-aware, more socially aware, it would have had an outcome such that we wouldn't have been reading about it, because they would have solved the problem in a way that was not just effective but safe. And I think that we can extrapolate that same mentality to the workplace. If you're the CEO, if you're the shift supervisor, if you're in any position of leadership, it need not necessarily be one of complex dynamic operations like a modern aircraft cockpit. If you're in the corner office of a white-collar firm, there are people on your team who are full of good ideas and can point out the proverbial red light or the needle outside the gauge. But if you don't create that culture of transparency and openness, they'll be disinclined to approach you. And when they do, they won't be too inclined to follow through on solutions if you shut them down.
So to put it in my manufacturing brain then, Shawn, what I've said is often when we have a quality defect out of a plant, I have this saying that there's probably somebody in that building that knew, right? That whether it was somebody that saw a repeated fault and didn't want to bug the maintenance guy to go fix this and then just push the fault through, and then that air proofing, let that part through, and then we get a defect to the customer. Do you find the same result or process in air when you've seen malfunctions in planes in that type area? Do you see something similar?
Yes. And, I've seen it both, you could say euphemistically, and I've seen it very literally. So early in my flying career, when I was a card-carrying aviator, out of training, I was at, let's just call it an undisclosed country in South America. And the day prior to me going in there, a plane had gone in and had failed to land that aircraft correctly, right? So very challenging airfield, short, surrounded on all sides by hazardous and treacherous terrain. The crew came in, to make an abbreviated story out of this, was not in a safe position to land on their first attempt. So they made a prudent decision. The aircraft commander said, all right, we're going to go around, try it one more time. Well, they circle back around. He's too high, he's too fast, but probably from misplaced pride decided, I don't want to go around a second time because heaven forbid somebody makes a joke at my expense at a bar 3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
So he took a situation where the plane was in an unsafe window and just through sheer will was going to put this thing on the pavement. Well, crew members on the cockpit voice recorder were either quiet or they were saying things kind of passively like, yeah, I don't know, boss, or yeah, we might be a little bit high, or we might be a little bit hot, meaning fast. Well, they touched down halfway down the runway too fast. They end up rolling off the end down into a ravine. Plane crashes, incinerates. Several people on board died. Well, the next day I go in there, and the aircraft wreckage was accessible. And so there was a tiny, teeny, piece of it. Nothing that would be needed for a mishap investigation. And I collected it. And tucked it into the sleeve of my before landing checklist. It was a checklist that's strapped to your knee, that's accessible to you throughout all phases of flight. And so for the rest of my career, the last thing I would always see before I would make that final determination, am I going to land this aircraft? It's a teeny sliver of the radome, the front end of that aircraft, to remind me, like, Shawn, better, smarter men and women than you have gotten themselves into predicaments because of emotional decisions. It wasn't that they weren't trained. It wasn't that they weren't experienced. It wasn't that they weren't smart enough. It was because in a heightened, passionate, emotional state, they subordinated the prefrontal cortex, higher functioning brain capabilities to that primal, limbic system that we have within us that's much more emotional in its decision making.
Yeah, I love the fact that you have something physical to keep you mindful, right? Keep us grounded. Because we're all going to get emotional at some point in time, and we overestimate our ability to have willpower, which doesn't really work. Whether you're flying a plane or whether you're just trying to make a part go through the line, and you just get excited.
That's right. And you're right. Excited is an operative word because we are as likely to make horrible decisions when we are euphoric as we are when we are angry, right?
Yeah. The emotions are not discriminatory in the fact of whether you're super excited and you're just so confident it's going to work that you are blind to the fact of, hey, there's probably some information that if you weren't so excited, we talk about that whole expansive thinking. And when you're not so excited or angry, like you said, we can see so much more.
So as a general rule, when you are a leader at any level, by the time a problem gets to you, it should be a tough one, because if your organization is designed correctly, simple problems with textbook solutions probably should have been resolved south of your level. So as a general rule, when you as a leader get a problem, it is quite possibly going to be laced with some emotional dynamite. And it's typically quite difficult to be at our intellectual best when we are at our emotional worst. And so that little sliver that was tucked safely in my before landing checklist that I looked at on my kneeboard as a pilot is now in a little frame that sits on my desk, because just because I teach this stuff doesn't mean that I have mastered this stuff. I am a human being, and I am imbued with a full range of emotions. And when people hear, oh, here comes the emotional intelligence guy who's going to teach us to hold hands and cry and hug, like, no. I believe that every single one of our emotions can and has played a critical part in our survival and development. I do not tell people that any emotion is inherently good or bad. We tend to think, well, happiness is the good emotion and anger is the bad emotion. Well, if in your anger during a board meeting, you flip over the table and start using cuss words and throw your cell phone against the wall, I would say that emotion inspired you to engage in behavior that was detrimental. But what if you are walking across a parking lot and you see a man beating his son for striking out in a Little League game, and that emotion called anger inspires you to act on that child's behalf? So the emotion doesn't have any inherent morality. It's how we manifest it, I think, is what makes a difference between cavemen and who we're supposed to be today, right? So what I really challenge people to understand is that you never need to apologize for your emotions.
Yeah.
Because those are so primal. Well before you think, you feel. You cannot turn that off. You cannot become a Vulcan like Spock where you're void of emotion. No, the challenge is, as a human, are you able to engage in behaviors despite your emotion that are most appropriate at that moment, at that time, for that situation with those people? And one day when I figure that out, I'll let you know, because I'm most certainly a work in progress.
Yeah, so you and I both have been very curious and gone deep into this whole how our emotions affect behaviors and how that affects results, and the whole sometimes I try not to use the word emotional intelligence too much because of some of the judgment on it, but you just explained it eloquently. And do you find that the more that you understand it and that you study it and that you become more aware of it, that it's almost like, oh my gosh, the more that I know, the more that I see in myself that I don't see it?
Certainly. And one of the things that I discovered through this journey is, and I think this is true for most things that bother us, is that once we understand why we feel a certain way or why some phenomena unfolds, that has a power in and of itself to take away some of its power, right? So, there are some hard and fast neuroanatomical and chemically physiological phenomena that happen within all of us human beings that once we understand what those are and how they manifest in us physically, that's probably half the battle, right? So once we understand, oh, okay, I've got one sympathetic nervous system, and when the amygdala in the left and right hemisphere of my brain detect a threat, they trigger the same acute stress response that my ancestors had triggered when a saber tooth was bearing down upon them. It's the same and only sympathetic nervous system that is triggered when you have to give bad news to your team at the end of a dismal quarter. Yeah. And sometimes I think we beat ourselves up, as leaders. Well, I'm 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old. Why am I getting nervous that I have to walk into a room and give bad news when somewhere out there a SWAT team's about to kick in the door and drag a dope dealer out, right? Or I'm not allowed to be nervous about this task because somewhere out there a Navy SEAL is on a high-risk mission. No. We don't need to apologize for why we get scared, why we have fear, why we have anxiety, why we get nervous, because we are only equipped with one physiological system. And it was great for helping us get away from that grizzly bear. Yeah. It can get in our way when we're trying to get through our day in 2023 America.
What I like, and I've seen really work, and here's the inspiration for all the listeners, is that the more that you have dialogue on it, so you're listening to this, and I really encourage you to have a conversation with somebody about this, about yourself, right? Like, what can you do after listening to this podcast? What's one thing you could do walking into the plant today? And it's just, recognizing, is there a time where maybe you got triggered and maybe you had some behavior that was driven by that emotion? But the great thing is that no, we're not going to all get it perfect, but we can hit the green more often, right? And is that what you see, Shawn? Is that when whether it's yourself or the people that you're working with?
Yes, and you use that word there, and the very word trigger can trigger a lot of people because it's oftentimes tossed around as a pejorative, like, oh, so-and-so's triggered because they didn't put chocolate syrup on their sundae, right?
Am I triggering you, Shawn?
But
you seem stressed.
Are
you stressed?
But most assuredly, triggers are a real thing. And so if I were, let's say as an instructor pilot, giving feedback to two people after a training sortie, and I give them identical feedback because they performed identical. Mm-hmm. What one of them hears is, wow, this guy really appreciates who I am. He's taken time to help me grow and develop. He really gave me some great insights that can help me improve. He pointed out some errors that I made that were somewhat oblivious to me. I appreciate him taking the time to give me a good, transparent, honest critique. What the other guy heard was his dad saying, you will never be as good as your brother, who was the valedictorian, who was the captain of the football team, who was the homecoming king. Same feedback to two different people who've had two different life experiences. Now, am I being a tad melodramatic? Yeah. But what I would challenge leaders to keep in mind is that your workers were people before they joined the company. They will be people after they leave. And the people that showed up to work have histories and experiences that are unique to them. Now, you're not their therapist. It's not your job to put everybody on the proverbial couch and pry into, the deep recesses of their childhood. But if we are with people long enough and we don't take the time to get to know them as people and only look at them as resources, then we will never be resonant with them. We will never be able to connect with them on a gut-to-gut level. It tells them, look, man, I get it. We've got a mission. We've got an objective. There are metrics we got to hit. But before you came to work here, you were somebody's son, daughter, mother, father, brother, sister. You'll be that when we leave. If you cannot engage and take into account that who you have working for you are individuals that are going to be motivated by or dissuaded by any number of leadership approaches, then you're not going to probably be able to get the absolute best out of them.
I love it. With all this technology where we can airproof these planes, and I know that I don't know the statistics exactly, but when I'm driving in my car, I'm always like self-aware, like this is a lot more dangerous than being in a plane because there's a lot more people I'm interacting with that are going through their own emotions and different issues. I always feel safer actually on a plane. So when I think about the technology and how safe our planes actually are, and we don't have to worry about the technical aspects as much because we had a higher probability of getting killed in a car on the freeway. So we know that part's sound. But I love when you bring it back where it's still so, I would say confusing, but it's like we're just starting to understand our minds and these emotions and the intellect and how you talk about this and how this ties in, Shawn. And what I'm hearing is we got to have a foundation of relationship, because if you don't have that relationship, you're not going to understand what that person's prior experiences are. So as you're giving that feedback, you need to have that connection to know how that feedback's going to affect each person. And then with the emotions, now they're saying a lot of the research is going around predictiveness. So if you've had a lot of rejection on your success, then that's going to predetermine how your body's going to accept that feedback from you. And is that kind of what you're seeing and as you're understanding your audience?
Well, so you hit on a key word there, which is relational. And you talked about, when you first began your remarks, about the technology of things that are at our disposal. So I don't think that we are lacking in tools, techniques, and technology to do our jobs from a logistical, financial, operational, administrative perspective. But we are getting really good at perfecting the science of management. And I think with that technology, we are neglecting the art of leadership. So sometime in antiquity, there was a matriarch of a hunter-gatherer tribe who was exercising leadership, and she did it without an org chart, without an HR handbook, without a bureaucracy. Leadership is innate to the human condition, and it starts with your first leader, which for many people, if they were blessed to have a mother, was mom, right? So we are naturally indoctrinated into a mode where we follow leaders who have our best interest. And I think that because we are born with that instinct, we tend to gravitate towards leaders who relate to us first as people. Now, it doesn't mean that, again, there are not profit and loss considerations. There are tangible, quantifiable metrics that got to be met. I mean, it can't be, let's just all sit down and sing Kumbaya. But you are more likely, from my experience, to be more productive when the people you're leading believe that there's a relationship there that actually transcends the purely transactional arrangement of boss, employee, leader, follower. So those different relational elements are actually pretty low-hanging fruit. It starts with the simplest of things, actually having conversations. When you're talking on the shop floor to somebody, are you really talking to them, or are you, glancing at your phone and keep holding up your finger? Hold on, I got to respond to this email. Okay. Much of what we can do that I think makes the biggest impact is so easy, and it's advice that your grandmother would have given you, which is take the time to listen to what other people have to say. It's really not that difficult. And I think sometimes we get so busy and we think that there must be this sophisticated solution to all our problems. I think it's a little more primal than that.
Interesting. I love the whole fact, and I'm a big fan of questions, right? Because it starts conversations, and direction and statements can create conflict, right? So it's like, man, why wouldn't we use more questions, like you say? But I guess that's why there's a constant struggle between our intellect and our emotions, is where we started. So Shawn, what's the main message you want our listeners to leave with?
I don't pretend for a moment to think that there are any number, especially if you're a leader, of issues that are hanging over your head that require some degree of technical proficiency, very explicit, metric-driven approaches. But at the end of the day, I would just really challenge you to think, when you catalog the people that were most important to you in your life, right? So you stop right now as a leader and you think, who was that favorite teacher? Who was that favorite coach? Who was that favorite uncle? And then ask yourself, was it because they were the most efficient person you knew, the most effective? They had the most awards, they had the most college degrees. I think what you'll find when you make that short list of favorite coach, favorite teacher, favorite uncle, favorite aunt, it's they made you feel valued. When you were in their presence, they made you feel truly valued. Why can't we be that way with the people that have been entrusted to our care? Does it mean that we're going to go 10 for 10 with our direct reports? Probably not. Despite our
No.
leadership, we will never probably have a perfect record of total buy-in. But if we stop and think, well, who did we truly love, respect, and admire when they had a position of leadership over us? Think about what their qualities were, and then ask yourself, are you exhibiting those qualities to the people following you? If you're not, I would say, look, it ain't too late. Game ain't over.
Yeah.
Make some small adjustments.
That's a great message to leave on. And when I look back, and I have so many I just talked to someone this morning I used to work with, and in many years since we talked, and it was just a great connection. And I have so many great stories and relationships. But then I've got a handful of people that I didn't leave better, right? And it's kind of like, I could have been more mindful of what you just said, of like, how am I making that person feel valued, regardless of the situation? Because we can still make them feel that way. Shawn, so grateful you taking the time coming on the show today for what you've done in your service and what you continue to do today, and help us just be a little bit more aware in our day-to-day and give us some inspiration. If our listeners want to know more about you, how can they follow you?
They could come to the website, which is www.ot2consulting.com. That's the number 2, ot2consulting.com. Or they can find me on LinkedIn.
Right on. Thanks so much, Shawn.
You're welcome.
Hey folks, appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone. Haven't subscribed yet? Do it now. Remember, if you want results, the key is increasing your awareness of how you show up.